It's quite a thrill to have finally brought today's speaker to Ithaca all the way from Texas. He had to get up at 4:30 in the morning. Let's give a thank you to Jim Hightower. When I took this job in 2008, Jim was the first individual I approached to see if he'd be willing to come to Ithaca and speak on campus, and that's because Jim knows independent media and he knows history. He knows that throughout U.S. history, media barons have demonized and marginalized movements for justice, and those movements have fought back by organizing their own independent media. As Jim loves to say, they didn't agonize, they organized. In the 1970s, Jim Hightower was the editor of a legendary independent magazine called the Texas Observer. In the 1980s, one of his first books was a consumer's guide to food profiteering, farming conglomerates. He was an advocate for family farmers before it was cool. In the 90s, Jim hosted a marvelous and unique populist national radio talk show, built up a following, 150 radio stations, but ABC mysteriously pulled the plug. Back in independent media all these years, he writes columns. He puts out the Hightower Lowdown newsletter, which is indispensable. His radio commentaries air nationally, including in Ithaca, Watkins Glen, a community radio station, WRFI, 88.1 FM, WRFI in Ithaca. It's Jim's plain-spokenness and sense of humor that allows him to reach people that other progressive advocates have a little trouble reaching. In fact, during the height of the Reagan era, in the 1980s, Jim was elected to statewide office in Texas as a Democrat twice, as agriculture commissioner. He wasn't defeated until 1990, partly undone by the smears and dirty tricks of a then little-known Republican campaign operative. Anyone know who that was? Karl Rove. Karl Rove, who went on to be a presidential campaign operative and became known as George W. Bush's brain. And who was the candidate who defeated Jim Hightower back in 1990 for agriculture commissioner? No, it was Rick Perry, who went on to become the governor of Texas for 14 years and then ran for president twice. Oops. As Jim told us an hour ago, Rick Perry put the goober in gubernatorial. Jim is famous for his one-liners. Few people who watched the Democratic National Convention in 1988 on national TV will forget when he held the floor, is up at the platform, and he described the then Republican presidential candidate, George Bush I. Jim said he was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple. President Reagan's idea of a good farm program, hee-haw. Media pundit Ann Coulter, she's loopier than a Coney Island whirligig. Now, ever bipartisan in his barbs, when Bill Clinton announced his team of economic advisors in 1992, Jim Hightower dubbed that team as, quote, the Wall Street firm of Benson, Rivlin, Altman, and Rubin. After Jim speaks, we're going to have a Q&A in this room, and then we'll move into the hall for a book signing. The most recent of Jim's 7 books is available for purchase and signing, and that's called Swim Against the Current. Even a dead fish can go with the flow. We also will be selling out there the famous book, one of my favorite books of all time, There's Nothing in the Middle of the Road But Yellow Stripes and Dead Armadillos. He's been a hero and a guiding light to so many of us in the independent media movement, the one, the only Jim Hightower.
Thank you. Hello, Ithaca. Thank you, Jeff Cohen, Adelaide Gomer, and the whole hierarchy of Ithaca College and the Park Center for allowing a scruffy Texas populist like myself to come into this center of erudition and enlightenment. Just a joy to join you, Jeff Cohenistas, in thinking about the state of American journalism, which really is a discussion about the state of American democracy. A special treat for me to be here with Jeff, share a program with him, my longtime cohort and co-conspirator, and the advancement of progressive, independent, non-conglomerate, non-conformist media. There's an old cowboy saying out in West Texas, speak the truth, but ride a fast horse. And Jeff's been speaking the truth to power and about power for years as a practitioner and analyst and activist, pushing on all fronts for journalism with a capital J, journalism with hair on it, as we would say in Texas. Henrik Ibsen said, you should never wear your best trousers when you go out to fight for freedom and truth. Well, it was not that long ago that being a journalist was a working class job. Rumpled clothes. After work, you go to a bar named Joe's, had a bartender named Flo. Because reporters were out of America's workaday majority, that was the political perspective that they brought to the news in those days. Reporters were diggers, seeing themselves as watchdogs of the power elites, not colleagues, seeing themselves as defenders of America's proud progressive values of economic fairness, social justice, equal opportunity for all people. That's the real journalism. That's the independent journalism, independent of the establishment, a historic force for protecting, expanding, and advancing our people's democratic aspirations and possibilities. No better source of this noble history than Jeff Cohen. Here's a piece he wrote back in 2008 about America's Indy heroes. Let me just buzz through a couple of these people just to give us a sampling of what it is to be a real journalist. Tom Paine, of course. His Common Sense pamphlet sold 150,000 copies back when there were only 2.5 million Americans. The labor weeklies that were put out all across the country, really, demanding public schools, no child labor, a 10-hour workday. And then they were attacked for being fanatical advocators. William Lloyd Garrison with his Liberator publication. He was jailed, he was assaulted, he was nearly lynched. The Georgia legislature offered a bounty to anyone who would kidnap Garrison and haul him to Georgia. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the great originators of the suffrage movement, founded a publication called The Revolution, upholding the truth that all men and women were created equal. They campaigned against sexual harassment, campaigned against job discrimination, campaigned against domestic violence. We seem to have that campaign continuing this very day. Equal pay for equal work. Well, these were just some of the kind of champions of real journalism. Here's one you might not know so well, Ida B. Wells. She was a pamphleteer, founder of the anti-lynching movement. She published the Memphis Free Press. The New York Times called her a slanderous and nasty-minded mulatress. She helped found the NAACP. J.A. Whalen created the Appeal to Reason, a socialist weekly based out in rural Kansas. Can you imagine that in Kansas today? Among his writers were Jack London, Helen Keller, and Mother Jones. He was subjected to postal harassment, assassination attempt, personal smears, and finally forced him to commit suicide. Robert Abbott had the largest black newspaper in the country, the Chicago Defender, and not only was a powerful force against Jim Crow laws and lynchings and et cetera, but he distributed his publication throughout the South through the sleeping car porters on the railroad cars who could haul it into all those places in the South. Mary Sanger had a magazine called Woman Rebel, advocated for working women's right to choose, originated the phrase birth control, launched Planned Parenthood. George Sells published In Fact, powerful publication exposing the fascist sympathies of the likes of William Randolph Hearst, took on tobacco's health dangers back in the 1940s because they were advertising in all these publications, and he exposed who they were. He said the most sacred cow of the press is the press itself. And that's a reality that we've gone through in the past, and that's not all of it. The populist movement, 1870s, 80s, and 90s, there was no media coverage, so they created their own media. They had more than 1,000 newspapers and linked up through the Reform Press Association. They had 2 huge magazines in terms of circulation, the National Economist and American Nonconformist. They had their own internet of the day, which was a series of speakers, lecturers they call it. It had 41,000 members of the lecture system. So on any given night, 41,000 people could go out and spread the message. Thomas Nast and the cartoonists, the power of those pictures. So many more. Ida Tarbell exposed the Rockefeller clan and the corporation, the monopolies that he ran. Upton Sinclair, I.F. Stone, of course, with his documents here at Ithaca College. Stud Sterkel, Molly Ivins, the Texas Observer, as Jeff indicated, I was an editor there. It was created back in 1954 because the media was not covering progressive politics at all, and progressive issues and activists, et cetera. Ralph Yarborough, then running for governor of U.S. Senate, he could have 5,000 people in Dallas, Texas, and it wouldn't get a mention in the Dallas News the next morning. So we had a slogan for the Dallas News: if it happens in Dallas, it's news to us. And another one, the Mountain Eagle, down in Whitesburg, Kentucky. Great old-time populist publication. Tom and Pat Gish ran that forever down there. And they had a subtitle, The Mountain Eagle, It Screams. And they covered labor, and they covered in the mining areas down there, and they covered the civil rights movement very strongly and supportive of it. So they got firebombed one week, and the next week the paper came out. And the subtitle said, "It still screams." So that's the feisty and gutsy and iconoclastic journalism that we need now more than ever before, I think. I come to you not just from Austin, Texas, but from South Austin. And we have a little different, more irreverent attitude over the south side of the river there. In fact, our unofficial slogan is, "We're all here because we're not all there." Well, I think we're gathered here, and I think this center exists because the mass media, TV, radio, the press, controlled by a handful of global conglomerates that aren't at all there on the media's essential democratic role in building democracy. The likes of Rupert Murdoch, Comcast, Carlos Slim, chief owner of the New York Times, Jeff Bezos, now owning the Washington Post, Disney, Clear Channel. I mean, these people are as confused as goats on AstroTurf when it comes to understanding their public responsibility to go after the bosses and the bankers, the big shots, bastards, and bullshitters who are running roughshod over the workaday people in this country. They get to think these powers that be get to thinking they're the top dogs, and we're just a bunch of fire hydrants, out here in the countryside. So they use every lever of power within their grasp. They bust unions with union-busting law firms. They offshore jobs. They use trade scams like the Trans-Pacific Partnership we're still grappling with. They use the front groups that the Koch brothers have developed. They've got the campaign money, of course, unlimited sums of money now, corporate money they can put directly into campaigns because, a corporation is a person and speech is that money equals speech. Of course, if money is speech, then speech is no longer free, right? I mean, literally, you have to buy it. They use the courts. They're political henchmen in the Congress and state legislatures, and of course they use the media. They use it all. You know, they say that in sex, and I don't know much about this, but Jeff was trying to explain it to me earlier, that using a feather can be erotic, but using the whole chicken is just nasty. These people, they're using the whole chicken on us. Now here we come with the topic of inequality, so pervasive, so entrenched in our society, our social, economic, and political fabric, that even the Trumpkins are mouthing the word inequality in that Republican presidential contest there, compelled to mention it at least from time to time. But the mass media allows them to get away with just kind of clucking their tongues about it, this widening chasm of inequality that's literally swallowing America's democratic pretensions. Inequality, however, doesn't just happen. It's caused by deliberate decisions that are taken by the power forces in our society, financial, economic, and political. Excuse the redundancy there. Now, a real journalism would connect these dots, but corporate media won't do that because honestly, connecting the dots would connect the media's corporate owners to the inequality. And I did have a little experience, as Jeff was indicating there, back in the mid-1990s, with this inherent conflict of interest by the corporate media. I had a radio talk show on ABC, and had it until the summer of 1995. 1 week in that summer, August, two things happened. The Telecommunications Act passed the U.S. Senate to become law. Bill Clinton would sign it. That allowed the conglomeration of the airwaves for the first time at a scale like that. The second thing that happened was Disney, on the heels of the Telecommunications Act, purchased ABC radio and TV network. So I went on the air on Saturday and allowed as how I now work for Mickey Mouse. And I had a little Mickey Mouse character on the air with me, and we played with it for a while. ABC didn't have a real big sense of humor, so a month later I was fired, teaching me that one thing, big money is willing for us to talk about abortion. They're willing for us to talk about gun control. They're willing for us to talk about all the social issues. But big money does not want us to talk about big money. And so I had to go. You know, there's a tombstone out in Arizona, an old gunfighter, a young gunfighter actually, and said, "I was expecting this, but not so soon." Well, a decade later, the national radio market pretty well locked down by Clear Channel. They had 1,200 stations. Larry Mays, the head of that, said, "We're not in the business of providing news and information. We're simply in the business of selling our customers' products." So much for the public interest. A TV executive for Fox affiliates down in Florida said, "We paid $3 billion for these television stations. We decide what the news is. The news is what we tell you it is." This is why Lily Tomlin has said, no matter how cynical you get, it's almost impossible to keep up. So as a result of that conglomeration, what is not news? Well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for one. Nuclearized NAFTA. 12 nations, not 3 as NAFTA had, 12. Huge, sweeping, secretive rigging of the rules to enthrone big pharma, big oil frackers, Walmart wage whackers, global privatizers, and other corporate giants over the people's sovereignty, literally allowing corporations to go to corporate tribunals outside of the U.S. And get decisions to overturn our laws. Been under negotiation by government trade executives and officials and by corporate executives for 7 years. Consumers, workers, farmers, even Congress members, not allowed a seat at the table. Member of Congress could not even go read it. And then when finally at the end they let them go read it, they couldn't take a staff person in there with them. They couldn't take a camera. They couldn't take notes on what they read. And so we weren't at the table. And there's an old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Well, Media Matters, a great organization, analyzed the mainstream broadcast coverage of Trans-Pacific Partnership in the last 2 years of its negotiation, including the first part of this year. And when the deal really began to move to passage, they analyzed the coverage of the networks and cable TV as well. ABC, CBS, and NBC, all of their evening newscasts, completely ignored the TPP. Not a single word was mentioned about it in those 18 months leading up to the introduction of the legislation in the Congress. PBS made 8 mentions of it during that period. CNN and Fox, 2 mentions each. MSNBC had 71 discussions about it, nearly all of them by Ed Schultz on the Ed Show. He was rewarded by being suspended for 3 days because he turned to the camera and said, "Mr. President, you are wrong about the TPP." That was the harshness of his voice. You are wrong. So he got suspended without pay for 3 days. And now he has been dumped by MSNBC, owned by Comcast. Whose views don't count? Whose views are excluded in this kind of conglomerated media? Just about any progressive voice and any advocate for progressive causes. Ralph Nader did a survey early this year looking at 15 years of TV and newspaper coverage on a broad range of issues. They found that Newt Gingrich and William Kristol were given more exposure than 25 major progressive voices combined. Bill Moyers, who, by the way, said that the delusional is no longer marginal. It has come in from the fringe to sit at the seat of power, talking about the Republican Congress. The most thoughtful and wide-ranging progressive voice of our time, Bill Moyers, retired this year, 40 years of work at public television. Tremendous advocate for our nation's founding principle of the common good, yet PBS, created to be of, by, and for the common good of the people, financed by the people, put none of its public money into his shows. He had to raise every dime of it by himself, and PBS hierarchy consistently tried to eliminate him. Workers themselves, the American majority, they don't count as news. You open up your newspaper, or this local New York Times, there's a business section, right? Where's the workers section? There are more workers than there are corporate executives. Every paper, every TV and radio news show has a market report giving you the Dow Jones average. PBS does that, and public radio does that hourly, just all across the board. Workers get covered only once a month when the unemployment statistics come out. And they do that wrong. They do it wrong because they count jobs. 210,000 new jobs created in America last month. Good news for America's workers. Well, not really, because the real issue for workers is wages. What do those jobs pay? You notice that the stock market report doesn't say AT&T sold 20,000 shares last month. They give the price of the share and whether it's up or whether it's down. They care about the price. Workers care about the wages, but they don't report anything about wages. I've long advocated that we need not just the Dow Jones average, but the Doug Jones average. You know, how's Doug and Darlene doing? You know, what's the price of what does rent cost? What about car repair? What about wages? What about the prime rate on a 6-pack of Bud? You know, I mean, these are things that would matter, that they'd like to have reported, but it's not in those pages. Well, enough about them. Let's talk about us. Indy media. While a lot of progressives wring their hands about the relentless concentration and conglomeration of the mainstream media, there's been a commensurate rise of people and groups who have joined hands to expand our network of grassroots media outlets, following the footsteps of those pamphleteers and other historic media innovators who came before. They can block us out of the corporate media, but they can't keep us from communicating, from building our own media. My old mama, who is old, we had her 100th birthday in August, she told us boys, and said, well, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Yeah, but I soon learned that 3 left turns do. And that's the attitude that I think we have to bring to these scraps. We are blessed with a full range of 3 left turners who found their way around the media blockage. We got about 120 alternative weekly newspapers in this country. They reach 17 million readers every single week. We got Nation, Progressive, In These Times, Mother Jones, Progressive Populist, Fair's Extra publication, My Lowdown, etc. Tons of publications out there reaching millions of people when you combine it up. Free Speech TV, doing a tremendous job there. They're now reaching more than 1 million regular viewers every single day. They're in 40 million homes, but they're actually tuning in. They can count more than 1 million people are tuning in on a regular basis to them, and that's about to explode because they're going into cable networks and also into the new internet boxes that seems to be the future of television. We've got hundreds of community radio stations such as WRFI right here, all over the country, just tremendous exciting groups. They have great names. I'm on about 175 of these stations, and there's like Chaos out in Olympia, Washington. We got KBOO in Portland, Oregon. KPIG down. They broadcast from the sty. Co-op in Austin, Texas, which literally is a cooperative radio station. WERU up here in Blue Hill, Maine. They say that WERU, they say we are you. That's the way that they put it together. It was initially funded by Paul Stuckey, Peter, Paul, and Mary. And also is on a radio show up there. It's not one that I'm on. It's a commercial station. I'm on a number of those, but not this one. But it's owned by Stephen King. And he bought it. And the first thing he did was to take Rush Limbaugh off the air. And and Limbaugh, of course, was his normal modest self, called up and said, "What the hell, you can't do that. You can't do that to me. I've got a contract." And King said, "Oh, yeah, I know you've got a contract. I'm going to pay you. I'm just taking you off the air." That's the attitude. So we've got all these, the cartoonists, Tom Tamara, whom y'all have honored with your Izzy Award here, Matt Worker, Jan Sorensen, Brian Duffy, Tom Tolles. I mean, these people, I'm eternally jealous of cartoonists because not only do they get it, but they draw a picture of it. One panel, done. So good. Tens of thousands of young video makers, documentary makers. This is the new media for people 25 and under, and it just reaches millions of people. It might be a minute long, it might be an hour long, it might be a full feature documentary, but it is powerful and it's very direct and in your face. Hundreds of thousands of social media journalists, plus the internet shows, the blogs, the books, speakers, newsletters, movies, artists, songwriters, coffee clutches, pub nights, and smoke signals, everything we can use, we ought to use to get it out there, get the message out. And aside from connecting more people to these independent media outlets, I see a couple of things that indie media needs to work on. First is our presentation needs less statistics and more storytelling. Facts are good, despite what Trump and Cruz and Fiorina and Ben Carson and the tinfoil hat crowd say, but use them as punctuation points, not your full text. There's a reason that the word numbers has the word numb inside it. But people relate to and are moved by stories. You know, Van Jones, a great young progressive leader. I was on a nation cruise of all things. That's a whole other experience. But anyway, with him, and he pointed out that chastising liberals for having too many talking points, etc., that Martin Luther King Jr. 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial did not say, "I have a position paper." He had a story to tell, and he painted it just beautifully, and that's why it connected with people. Deanna Zant, who's a guru of social media, works with us on the lowdown. She's on our board, in fact, and is from down the road in Binghamton, where she grew up, now in Brooklyn. But she did a wonderful thing a couple of years back. Remember when the Komen Foundation when defunded Planned Parenthood? And there was a big fury about it. And so a number of people, some sparklies too, said, well, send money to Planned Parenthood, and people did. But Deanna was thinking, well, what about people who don't have money to send? They're mad too. What could they do? So she put up a social media site called Planned Parenthood Saved My Life. And stories poured in from all across the world, really. And Planned Parenthood got 5 million new email addresses from that one website. People telling their stories, very personal stories, and that made it work. Well, we can make this happen. Our treasure trove of progressive media resources, print and broadcast, internet, speechifiers, etc. The second thing we need to do, though, is to connect more, coordinate, cooperate, collude even. The point is to amplify our message. Instead of one publication running a story about some big issue, what if, in, say, a 2-month span of time, 4 national magazines ran stories on the same issue, ran their own versions of it, but stories on that same issue, and a dozen alternative weeklies localized the story for their readers, and 50 community radio stations did interviews and local features on the story. And what if Rachel Maddow and Tom Hartman did segments with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders about that story? 24 cartoonists, what if they did caricatures of the story? And what if social media ran an activist campaign to do something about the story? And on and on. The story would then echo across the land, because people would hear it from 3 or 4 different ways and 3 or 4 different times. And not only would the people hear it, but even the mainstream media would say, something's going on. And as usual, we don't know what it is, but and even some politicians, it might get through to them, to the level that they would have to at least take note of it. Well, to me, this is an effort. This independent media is building to be the media in the long haul, the media that matters, the democratic media, little d, democratic media. That is an effort that is worthy of all of us, for we're not just building an independent media, but we're building democracy. You can't have democracy if you don't communicate, if you don't get facts out, and if you don't get stories out, if you don't get reality put into the discussion. Cynics and corporatists and others will say, well, it's just folly. It can't be done. Impossible to defy the corporate order. They've got all the money. They control the airwaves, and they control the Congress. You can't do that. But as a friend of mine who's been a pioneer in the organic movement put it to me once, he said, Hightower, those who say it can't be done should not interrupt those who are doing it. And that would be you. You good people right here in Ithaca, and people like you all across the country are making it happen. You don't hear about it, you don't read about it in the establishment media, but this is everywhere, and it's very, very powerful. It adds up to, as I say, a media that matters. I'll leave you with this thought. It's from a moving company down in Austin when I first moved to Austin in '76. It's just a little company, one of these big chains or anything. It's a moving company, and I think it's two guys in a truck, you know. I think their names were Skeeter and Booger, or something like that. And Skeeter and Booger's moving company. But they had an ad in the Yellow Pages with a real can-do attitude that said, if we can get it loose, we can move it. That's what we're talking about. Get it loose at the grassroots level, and the people will move it for themselves. Thank you very much for what you're doing. Proud to be with you. Yes.
I'm a student, but not at this university. I'm a student.
You're welcome anyway.
I work on single-payer health care.
Yes.
And we have passed the bill, New York Health has passed the State Assembly, 92 to 52. We are now working on getting it through the New York State Senate, which is very difficult, and we're passing resolutions around, especially Tompkins County, and hoping to branch out into other counties across New York State. The federal is a whole different kettle of fish at this point. The fish are rather just lying dead at the bottom, and since we're in a drought, there's no water, so they've rather died.
Pretty strong metaphor, yeah.
Yes. Anyway, my question to you is, many of the people in New York State, in this country, vote, if they vote at all, especially in the rural areas, vote against themselves. How do we, because they are not getting the information from Fox and many of the mainstream media corporations, how do we get to these people? What is the I don't want to say the trick, but what is how do you recommend this?
Just everything you can think of. Establishment media is not going to do it for you. But spread the alternative media. Like I say, try to see if you could develop the kind of campaign I just did there at the end, where you take and I would urge you to not call it single payer, just say Medicare for all, you know, whatever so it's simple. I mean, people get it. You know, you're born, you get Medicare, you know, for the rest of your life. That ought to be the system. Anyway, whatever you do, phrase it right, and then see if you could get a couple of independent papers and a couple of community radio stations and a traveling roadshow with some of Ben and Jerry's clever tricks. You know, they have a Dunker lobbyist booth, for example. You know, people love that. And make it fun. Have a parade through some of these towns, and you know, we're going to have a town hall meeting on this, you know, this topic about why you don't have health care, and you know, drum it up like that, and then you know, make it. It can become probably not on its first outing, but it can become big enough that then the local papers, establishment papers, are going to have to cover it. And you, by the way, you should be going to sit with them, their editorial boards. You know, we are citizens here. We pay taxes. We have an issue that's very important to this community, particularly the rural people. And it's important that you cover this. And if you don't, then we're going to be back. But maybe back with placards and demonstrations out front. You know, why are they not doing this? So first you ask permission, and then you get in their face. And then anything else you can think of like that. And then you put it into, you have, there's a group called Drinking Liberally. They're down in Manhattan, I know, but you know, you get people together once a week to have some brews, and you talk about issues. You know, occasionally, you know, you have these coffee clutches and people gathering in bars and stuff, and they make small talk. Well, they every now and then have some big talk, and this is a perfect topic to do that. And you'll find somebody, you know, gets involved. To a quick little side story there, I was with Fred Harris last year, former senator out of Oklahoma, great guy, and he's now living in Albuquerque. And I was out there, and we went to this place, and we were sitting around shooting the breeze, and the topic turned to baseball, and somebody mentioned Lou Gehrig, and this young guy said, "Who's Lou Gehrig?" I said, "Oh, well, you know, New York Yankees, Hall of Fame baseball player. You know, he died young. You know, he died of Lou Gehrig disease." And the guy said, "He died of Lou Gehrig disease? What are the chances of that?" So you see, you can break through every now and then. You know, a couple of beers. You get it in the churches, you get it in the civic clubs, you get it anywhere you can get it. So it's a long, slow building process. You don't get there the first time out necessarily. In fact, very few social movements have done that. The suffragists started up the road here, Seneca Falls. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, they never voted. 70 years from the 1842 meeting, Seneca Falls, to the time the amendment passed and women could vote for the first time ever. So it's a building process. As I said earlier to the group, that Willie Nelson once told me that the early bird might get the worm, but it's the second mouse that gets the cheese. I always have to let that lay out there a little bit. So just persevere, that's what I say, and get creative, and have fun. Make it fun. Yes?
So you talked a little bit about corporate influence on journalism, and what we see right now happening with the election season is like the 2010 passage of Citizens United v. FEC with super PACs, and how in the current debates Trump adamantly talks about, oh, I gave money to this candidate, I gave money to this candidate, and Bernie Sanders talks about how he's trying to stay away from that corporate influence. How do you think corporate influence comes on the political spectrum?
It owns it. It's what Donald Trump admitted. I give money to all these candidates, and then I call them, and they do what I want. I don't think that's entirely true, but pretty close. And that's the importance of having somebody like Bernie running. He raised first $15 million in his last report. His average contribution was $31.20. You can't buy a president for $31.20. But you can buy a president who will not be bought for $31.20. And that's the way to think about it.
I have a concern about a bias in independent media that I hope you can address, which is that there's so many ways that we're getting shafted and shot down by the ruling elite that it's really easy to spend all our time fighting that. And I know I have so many people who say I can only do democracy now 2 days in a row. I just get too depressed. And I wish there was a way to just sort of have an idea that like 10% of the time we'll cover successful things in urban agriculture, food sovereignty, participatory democracy. There's a million great things going on. Absolutely. But we're fighting battles against these nasty, nasty people, and we forget to put enough of the success stories of people power. So I'm just wondering if you could address that challenge.
Oh, absolutely. I'm so glad you raised it, because that is just, you can't have a movement that has no successes. I mean, who's going to stick with it, And yet, as you indicate, we have successes all across the country. I've been just about every place that's got a zip code, and every place I've been, there's somebody or some group of somebodies, or even a coalition of groups of somebodies that are doing powerful things, making big changes, including money in politics. We had this some years back now, but we had a group to take on, to try to do limit campaign contributions in Austin city elections. And the group called themselves Austinites for a Little Less Corruption. And so we've got a campaign limit now. It's been in place for 10 years. And of course they thought, well, this won't work. This is disastrous. It's going to just allow the rich to buy it. None of that happened. It works. And I'm involved with Citizen. I'm on the board of Public Citizen, a national great organization that's kind of leading the charge, along with Move to Amend, on this undoing Citizen United with the constitutional amendment, and that has just exploded all across the country. I don't know the numbers now, but it's more than like 2,000 cities have passed resolutions, and counties calling on Congress to send a constitutional amendment to the people so that people can vote on it. I think more than a dozen state legislatures have done the same, and not just in the states you would expect. I mean, 78% of Republicans want Citizen United undone. This is not an argument we have to win. It's one we have to organize and bring it to focus and bring it to power. And there are 145 members of the House that are signed on to the legislation to do it. And I forget how many senators, but a good number of them. I think about a third of the senators have as well. So we're not without power. And then you got people like Elizabeth Warren inside, and she's given courage to other Democrats who sometimes are weaker than Canadian hot sauce, to stand up. So having that kind of force in there makes that more possible. So you need to get the numbers on these successes that are going on and the specifics. And they're available from Public Citizen. I think that's citizen.org. Or for the Move to Amend people, too. I guess movetoamend.org, probably. And the same thing with a number of different issues. You mentioned food, and I've been very involved in that for eons. That is a phenomenal populist success that came from the people themselves. Farmers didn't want to use those kind of chemicals, didn't want to do that to food, either animals or plants. Consumers didn't want that food. So they created what we called in my last book the Upchuck Rebellion. People don't want industrialized food. And so that's why farmers markets flourish. That's why direct marketing, buy local, food in the farm to school, farm to prison, all these things work is because it works economically, but it also works aesthetically. It's bigger than what you see and more beautiful than what you see. And so that's created a food revolution so much that now Walmart, is trying to be in on it, and all the big corporations and et cetera want to claim that our food is natural, grown in the ground, something. So it's just a remarkable success story. And I just came. I was 1 week ago today. I was in Chicago where Farm Aid was taking place, and we had panels there, and every one of those farmers who were there, as well as then the chefs and the environmentalists and consumers and others who took part in this conference. Farm Aid now has a conference as well as a concert. Every one of them understood what the issue was. The issue is that too few people control too much of the money and power, and they're using that to get more for themselves at our expense. So that unites farmers with farm workers, with consumers, with environmentalists, and that's pretty much the whole picture right there, much less. And I told them, you've got to, you go to these farmers markets and your customers come to you, and they buy your product. You sell your food products, but you ought to be selling your mission as well and selling your issues. Here's what we need in the way of a farm bill, local as well as state as well as then national. But so much can be done local, and that's happening. I was down at Saratoga Springs last year, I guess it was. The Sustainable Agriculture Food Movement had a big conference there, and they're just doing phenomenal things in this region. What have you got, about a 5-month growing period here? It's amazing what people can do in that period of time. Elliot Coleman and Barbara Damarage, they're organic farmers up in Maine, and they have what's called 4-season farms. They farm year-round in Maine, a place that has 18 days of sun and warm sun, and no soil at all. It's all rock. And they produce a cornucopia off of it. It's just astounding, and the systems that they've developed, and people are picking that up and learning it and adapting it to the local level. And that's what I would say to a lot of people, and do say, is that, we're all going to be involved in the national election. That's important, but you're going to be most effective at a local election. You can really make things happen there. And when you make it happen there, then it can climb up to a state level, and then it can go to the national level. So I think we're in that building process. But you're absolutely right. We have to tell the stories of success. We have thousands of them out there. And we have to remember that Mr. Humor is our friend.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thanks for your words. Speaking of those local initiatives that push to the statewide level, my name is Jennifer, and I'm helping organize the local former Move to Amend chapter. Our representative, our state senator in New York, is saying that he's going to sign a GOP-sponsored letter calling on Congress. This would make us have majorities in both parts of the state legislature to be the 17th state to call on a constitutional amendment that would overturn effectively Citizens United. But so this is a very conservative and uncontended senator, and he represents us here in Ithaca, so please know who he is. He's your representative. Call him tomorrow. His chief of staff is telling me that he, with some adjustments to the letter of Senator Boyle, who is a Long Island senator, will sign. I don't know if this is real. I think we can push it over the finish line, and I would encourage you to call his Elmira office tomorrow and Monday and get through and leave a voicemail if they're turning it off at that point, because they have already, and we can push it through the finish line and continue to build the popular movement for this democracy here, right here in Ithaca.
Terrific.
Oh. Senator O'Mara is our representative in Ithaca and the surrounds, and he's thinking very seriously to be the last senator needed to create a majority to sign the letter from Senator Boyle, from Long Island. So you can call and inquire, is he signing a letter to call on Congress to amend the Constitution?
How do people contact you or your organization?
We broke away from Move to Amend, so we're a local democracy group meeting on October 7th at the Common Spot on the Commons, which is above Patroons and Sheldon Hill. Perfect. 7 o'clock, October 7th, it's a Wednesday night. You can look at New York, ny4democracy.org, and you can contact me at theyogalocation@gmail.com. For lack of a better contact right now, theyogalocation@gmail.
Terrific. That's how it happens.
Call Senator O'Mara and Elmira.
Yeah. You know, there are issues like this, side point, based on what she just said, that we also can't make assumptions about who people are, that well, they're Republican or they're conservative. Well, you know, the real political spectrum in our country is not right to left. That's theory. Ideology. The real spectrum is top to bottom. That's your zip code. That's life. You know where you are on that. And the vast majority of people in this country, good 80% of them, know that they're no longer in shouting distance of the powers at the top, whether they're corporations or politicians, and no matter what their party affiliation is. So people on so many of these issues, as I said, 78% of Republicans want this thing repealed. Constitutional amendment. Big fracking fights up here, right? You know, they're all across this country. Yeah. Now those people are, I don't know about here, but in places I've been, and I've been involved in this fracking fight around the country, and particularly in Texas, where, you know, we have earthquakes now. There was a fracking well on DFW Airport, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, and they had an earthquake that got that well removed overnight. But my point is that I'm sure you're wondering what it is, but it is that these people doing the fracking battles are mostly apolitical or at best Republican, and they can't believe that these corporations are doing this to them and that the Republican Party is allowing that to happen, even abetting it, and they're looking for friends. And I've been saying to my progressive pals, I spoke to the Progressive Caucus of Congress meeting in Philadelphia earlier this year, and I told them, talking about this fracking thing, oh yeah, we know about fracking, yeah. Well, go out there and talk to these people, because they're looking for help, you know, and they don't care what your ideology is. And in fact, your ideology could become theirs, you know, if you show that you're on their side. That's what people are really looking for. Who's going to be on our side in these big, big battles? So we've got a lot of possibilities here. Yes.
You talked about the importance of independent media. I totally agree. But there seem to be some funding problems there. Let's take the example of radio. Say there are all the FEC regulations, and then if the funding is from 501c3, there are all the 501c3 regulations. And it winds up that if you'd like to talk about, let's say, a local business that is doing something good, well, maybe you can't because it could be seen as advertising, or you'd like to talk about a really great candidate, but you can't because that would threaten the 501c3 funding. So perhaps you can address all of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I'd like to feel sorry for you, but, you know, nobody's busting your door in to take away your family. Nobody's lynching you. Nobody's shooting you. Nobody's doing the kind of things that people have endured in this country to fight to make this democracy advance just a little bit, incrementally even, over the years. So I would just say don't get so discouraged by things like that. One, you can find your way around most of those problems. My newsletter, Hightower Lowdown, is a 501c3. But, you know, we don't have any problem talking about Bernie Sanders. You know, I don't say go vote for Bernie Sanders, but I can tell that story about $31.20 is his campaign contribution. So there are many ways around, and more creative ways that you will think of when you put your heads together on it and try to have a little fun with it, push back. And sometimes you're getting prevented from saying some of those things can itself become an issue that will then aid your cause, because people will think that's not right, you know. And that's the most powerful political words in America. That's not right, because that'll build political support. There's a great organization called National People's Action. I think they're in New York. I'm not sure where they are. But they're in about 18 different states, and there's a real grassroots force. And I spoke at their convention recently, and they have a call out that comes. You said something like, you know, the billionaires are able to get in to see the president, and you can, and they'll just shout out, "That's not right." An indignation, you know, a little indignation helps, and then creativity and fun.
Hi, I'm from Kentucky, and I appreciate your shout out to the Mountain Eagle.
Oh.
I'm looking around here, and quite a few of us have gray hair, and I'm wondering where you find excitement and leadership amongst the younger people.
Oh, well, certainly on the internet and social media, they are that force, and have created a whole new dimension of communication and organizing through that. The Fight for 15. That's young people of color, immigrants, and the least likely people to rebel, the most likely people to get fired for doing anything, the least educated, the least paid, etc. Yet they are the ones who really are the leaders of the labor movement today, which unions themselves will acknowledge. Unions are assisting them, but they know that the power comes and the creativity comes from those people themselves, using social media primarily to do their organizing and strategizing. It's really amazingly effective. And think of what they've achieved. Republicans in Congress won't consider more than $7.25 an hour, which is where we are, minimum wage. They want to do away with minimum wage. That's Carly Fiorina's latest. And then, so Obama came in and said, well, what about, let's do $9. And then came Fight for 15, saying $15. And the establishment media said, oh, it's completely beyond the bounds. I mean, this is ridiculous. Get out of here. But it caught on. It caught on with the big public because they're thinking, yeah, $15 an hour isn't all that much, you know, to try to live in a city today. So that makes sense, and I'm close to that myself, or I'm tumbling down toward it. And so then they get involved in it. And now we've got not only Seattle, but Los Angeles, several cities, not just on the West Coast, but elsewhere as well, at $15. We have a number of fast food, independent business fast food chains that are paying $15 an hour. So they've just made a huge difference just by being creative and having the audacity of youth to just go out there and do it, risk it all. So I think young people, and I was with a group, there's a National Young Farmers Association that's doing very creative things for people trying to get into farming. It's very hard to do now. And all kinds of youth efforts that are underway that are very encouraging and that are the most encouraging thing that's happening. And we got young people now beginning to run for office locally, mostly, and winning some as well. So yeah, I have a lot of faith in young folks, and I would say, yeah, at most of our gatherings that we have, there's more, gray hair than 20-year-olds or something, but that's largely because these are people who are able to commit some time and commit some money to this sort of a progressive effort. So, behind us are going to be a generation that's not yet gray hair, but will be in another 10 years, and they'll move into this. And you can get young people involved in your meetings. Mainly you need to go to their meetings or ask how you could help them in their meetings, and then you'll begin to, as I say, rub up against each other a little bit and get to know each other and trust each other and have a couple of beers, lubricate the movement, and you begin to have something strong.
So I guess adding on to the role of young people, you talked a little bit earlier about how grassroots movements have changed, such as women's suffrage and the NAACP. What do you think, or are there any leaders that are younger that maybe young people from like my generation can look out to and follow?
Yes. And I mean, Van Jones, he's a little older than your generation, but he's become a phenomenal national figure in progressive politics and progressive media, including independent media, a little bit establishment, not much, but some. And people like this Deanna Zand I was just talking about, she's young, and the whole, and then some of the sparklies as well, musicians and movie people are getting involved in issues and standing up. And gay rights was largely facilitated by those, by the energy and idealism and creativity of young people, and led in many cases. And certainly the Black Lives Matter, I think that woman was 21 who essentially started that. So there's, and I don't have all the examples in my head, but there are beaucoup of them. And I think I can point you, maybe later we're going to talk anyway, to a couple of organizations that you might check in with.
So one of the things I really admire about you is your capacity to take very complex things and somehow fit them in this little radio spot. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it, because you got to be like spending all day thinking about it to be able to do that, how it is that you manage to convey that complexity. Because, I'm one of those numbers people that, I don't get numb from numbers. So if people are like trying to gloss over the top and be all Hollywood about it, I'm not happy. But you don't do that. So can you tell me a little bit about how it is you get to being able to get the message across in a way that has all the nuance and has the complexity there, but also has that punch and brevity that makes it work?
Well, okay, won't tax your patience long with this, but basically I'm pretty simple-minded, and yeah, that's what college did for me. I learned to organize writing in college, and then I've been doing these radio commentaries since 1993. So, and they run 300 to 310 words. That's the package, and you got to have a teaser at the top. You got to then tell what the story is and then what you can do about it at the end. So it became a craft. Practice is another thing. I just have been doing them every weekday since 1993, so had to learn something. And then the sort of the punchiness comes from the fact that my father's name was High, and I had a great sense of humor, and I grew up in a culture that had a kind of jiving, self-deprecating sort of humor to it, a small town humor. So I've always had the humor. I kind of just grew up with that. And if you start with the humor, then that helps. But the real key to writing is to keep asking yourself at the very start, and anytime you get stuck, what am I trying to say? And if you can answer that, you can do the next sentence. And so that's basically it, writing by Hightower. Y'all been terrific. Thank you so much.